In the secluded highlands of western North Carolina, where morning fog settles in hollows that time seems to have forgotten, there exists a documented account that has confounded scholars for over a century and a half. In 1842, the Reverend Alistair Finch and his 10-year-old twin daughters, Elara and Lyra, arrived at the isolated Methodist parish of Oakhaven, a community so remote that maps of the period barely noted its location. The events of their 4-day visit were painstakingly recorded in the private journal of Pastor Silas Croft, a document unearthed in 1991 when the old chapel was finally dismantled. The journal entries detail occurrences so specific, so unnaturally precise that modern analysts have studied them in depth. Yet, none can fathom how 2 young children could hold knowledge that defied all rational explanation. The Finch twins did not merely foresee future events. They exposed secrets buried for generations, described individuals they had never encountered, and spoke of tragedies that happened long before they were born. But perhaps most astonishing of all, every single detail they offered was proven to be verifiably true. This channel is not for the faint of heart, but for those courageous enough to face mysteries that challenge our perception of reality itself. Before we delve into the Finch case, ensure you are subscribed, as we are about to reveal information most historians are unwilling to discuss. Let us know in the comments which state you are watching from, because the events in North Carolina may have parallels closer to your own home than you imagine. The tale begins not with the supernatural, but with a far more disquieting concept: the possibility that certain human minds can tap into information in ways science has yet to understand. The North Carolina of 1842 was a territory caught between untamed wilderness and encroaching civilization, where settlements like Oakhaven were nestled in virtual isolation among the Blue Ridge Mountains. This specific community had been founded in 1821 by 4 families searching for religious autonomy, far from the doctrinal disputes of larger towns. By the time the Finch family arrived, Oakhaven was home to nearly 150 souls, mostly connected by blood or marriage, all united by the strict Methodist principles that guided their existence. The community's heart was a humble wooden chapel, constructed by their own labor with timber from the surrounding forests. Pastor Silas Croft, an educated man who had left a comfortable life in Asheville to minister to these frontier people, kept the only written accounts of births, deaths, weddings, and notable happenings. His meticulous record-keeping would become essential in chronicling the events that were to come. Alistair Finch was a known presence on the circuit of remote parishes scattered across the Appalachian region. Tall and weathered, with prematurely graying hair that hinted at hardships beyond his 38 years, he journeyed on foot with his daughters, carrying only a scuffed leather satchel with his Bible, a few personal effects, and a journal for his spiritual reflections. He had been a widower for 10 years, since his wife Eleanor died giving birth to the twins during a brutal winter blizzard that left their cabin snowbound for weeks. The girls, Elara and Lyra, were remarkable in their identical looks but completely different in personality. Elara, born just minutes before her sister, had an outgoing disposition that instantly charmed people. Her smile was contagious, her laughter authentic, and she spoke with a self-assurance beyond her years. Lyra, more reserved and watchful, often seemed to be in her sister's shadow. However, those who paid close attention saw that she frequently started sentences Elara would complete, or answered questions meant for her sister before Elara could speak. What set the Finch family apart among the traveling ministers was Alistair's reputation for bringing spiritual revival to congregations in decline. Legends followed them from parish to parish. Tales of the faithless returning to the fold, of communities settling deep-seated feuds, of spiritual awakenings that lingered for years after they left. Some credited Alistair's fervent sermons, but careful observers noted that the true transformations often started after private talks with the twins. The trip to Oakhaven had been especially arduous. Recent autumn downpours had turned the mountain trails into slick mud, and Alistair had to carry Lyra the last 5 miles after she came down with a fever. They reached the settlement at dusk on October 12, 1842, just as Pastor Croft was finishing evening prayers with the few parishioners who attended midweek services. Croft later wrote that his initial impression of the family was one of profound exhaustion, not just physical but spiritual. Alistair's attire was travel-worn and mended, his boots thinned by endless miles on mountain paths. The girls stayed near their father. Lyra was still pale from her illness, and Elara's typical vivacity was muted by fatigue. Yet, something in their eyes, an attentiveness, an awareness that seemed out of place for their age, made Croft feel inexplicably uneasy. The Oakhaven congregation had welcomed many itinerant preachers over the years, but the Finches were different from the start. That first night, as the family ate a modest supper with the Croft family, Elara asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically wondering if the lilacs by the western wall had recovered from the fungus that almost destroyed them 2 summers ago. Mrs. Croft dropped her fork, gaping at the child in shock. The lilac fungus had indeed struck 2 years before, ruining her treasured garden, but it was not a matter she had discussed with anyone outside the close-knit community. When questioned, Elara just smiled and said she had dreamed of lilacs on her journey and somehow knew that Mrs. Croft cultivated the finest ones in the county. This event, noted in Pastor Croft's journal that same evening, was merely the first of many that would defy everything the Oakhaven community thought they knew about the natural world. The following morning broke gray and chilly, with a sharp wind that shook the windows of the small cabin where the Finch family was staying. Pastor Croft awoke early, as he always did, to work on his sermon. He found Alistair already up, seated by the fading embers of the fire, his Bible open but his gaze fixed on the distance with a look of deep unease. The girls had unsettling dreams last night, Alistair said when Croft asked about his worried expression. They often dream of the places we are to visit, but these dreams were different, darker. Before Croft could reply, Elara appeared at the door, her hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes sharp and focused. "Pastor Croft," she said in her clear, childlike voice, "in your chapel, beneath the 4th floorboard from the pulpit, something is hidden that does not belong there. Lyra dreamed of it, and I dreamed of why it is hidden." The pastor felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He had, in fact, hidden something under those exact floorboards. A bottle of brandy, a symbol of his persistent struggle with temptation. No one knew. He had put it there in a moment of weakness 4 months earlier, reasoning it was better to keep it nearby to resist it daily, rather than remove the temptation completely. It was a secret that brought him profound shame, one he had admitted only to God in his solitary prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Croft asked, his voice wavering. Lyra slipped out from the shadows behind her sister, moving with the strange, silent poise that seemed to define her. "The bottle is dark green," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that was once a baby's shawl." A green shawl. Croft collapsed into his chair as if his legs had given out. The cloth was indeed a piece of a baby's shawl, the one that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 6 years prior. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failings, both as a father who could not save his child and as a pastor who could not overcome his own weakness. Alistair watched his host's reaction with an expression that blended sympathy with weary acceptance. "It began when they were very young," he explained quietly. "At first, I thought it was just childish intuition, how little ones can sometimes perceive things adults overlook. But as they got older, their insights grew more specific, more impossible to explain by natural means." That Sunday service would be etched in the memory of every member of the Oakhaven congregation for the rest of their lives. Alistair's sermon was moving, but not out of the ordinary for a circuit preacher. A fervent appeal for spiritual revival and the confession of sins. It was what transpired afterward that defied all rational explanation. As the parishioners began to leave, Elara approached Silas Blackwood, a well-to-do farmer known for his generosity to the chapel and his high standing in the community. She looked up at him with her innocent green eyes and said, "Mr. Blackwood, the money you've been taking from the chapel collection isn't truly stealing if you intend to return it, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." The color vanished from Blackwood's face. For 7 months, he had been pocketing small sums from the offering plate to cover debts from a failed land deal in Charleston. He had convinced himself he would repay every cent once his finances recovered, but the missing funds had been a cancer on his conscience. Before Blackwood could form a response, Lyra moved to her sister's side and addressed Agnes Thorne, the elderly widow who acted as the chapel's unofficial moral compass. "Mrs. Thorne, your husband didn't perish in the logging accident, did he? He is still living somewhere, and that is why you conceal the letters." The old woman staggered as if she might collapse. Her husband had, in fact, abandoned her and their children 12 years earlier, taking their life savings and vanishing one night without a word. She had concocted the story of his accidental death to protect her dignity and her children's standing in the community. The letters Lyra spoke of were the sporadic messages she received from him, begging for forgiveness and detailing his new life in Arkansas. She had never mentioned them to a soul. One after another, the twins went through the congregation, speaking in low tones to different members. To Dr. Monroe, they referred to patients who had died under his care because of his insufficient medical knowledge. To the Barrow family, they spoke with certainty of the son they kept sequestered in their loft, a young man whose simple mind was a source of shame to them. To young Elias Vance, they described in detail his clandestine meetings with Clara Jennings, the married woman whose husband was often away on business. Each revelation was made with childlike simplicity, devoid of judgment or malice, as if the girls were merely commenting on the weather. Yet the precision of their words was so absolute, so impossible, that the congregation was paralyzed in a state of terror and wonder. Pastor Croft watched in horrified awe as his stable community was unraveled by 2 10-year-old children who spoke of secrets that should have been known only to God. But it was Elara's final declaration that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. She walked to the front of the chapel, stood before the pulpit, and laid her small hand on the wooden cross carved by the chapel's founding members. "This is hallowed ground," she said, her voice echoing through the silent sanctuary. "But it has been tainted by what occurred here before. The Ashworth family did not die in a cabin fire, did they, Pastor Croft? They died right here, in this very room. And some of you know precisely why." The ensuing silence was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself awaited a response to this unbelievable charge. The mention of the Ashworth family was a physical shock to the congregation. Pastor Croft, his face as white as winter frost, clutched the pulpit so hard his knuckles turned pale. The Ashworth tragedy was Oakhaven's most guarded secret, a wound that had never truly healed despite 21 years of communal silence. In 1821, when Oakhaven was a new settlement of scarcely 40 people, the Ashworth family had been among its most respected members. Josiah Ashworth was both the blacksmith and the de facto leader, while his wife Abigail was renowned for her skill with herbal medicines and her gentle touch with difficult childbirths. Their twin daughters, Mercy and Grace, were the community's treasures, bright, lovely 10-year-old girls who sang in the chapel choir and assisted their mother in caring for the sick. The official version of events, the one recorded in Pastor Croft's predecessor's meticulously kept records, was that the Ashworth family had died in a tragic cabin fire during a winter storm. Their bodies were supposedly found in the ruins of their home and interred in the chapel cemetery with proper ceremony. The community mourned, rebuilt, and carried on, as frontier settlements had to do when disaster struck. But Elara's words hinted at a much darker truth, one that several of the older parishioners had prayed would stay buried forever. Elder Gideon Croft, now 75 and a member of Oakhaven's founding families, slowly got to his feet. Arthritis made every movement a struggle, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was heavy with the authority of decades. "Child," he said, his words deliberate and cautious, "you speak of events that transpired before you were born, in places you have never visited. How can you possibly know what you claim to know?" Elara turned to him, her green eyes holding a disquieting maturity. "Mercy Ashworth had a birthmark on her left wrist," she said softly. "Grace had one on her right ankle. Mercy always had a small carved bird her father made for her, and Grace wore a bronze locket with a lock of their mother's hair. When they died, Mercy was in her yellow Sunday dress, and Grace was in her nightdress because she had been sick with a fever." These details, which no outsider could possibly know, caused a ripple of recognition among the older members of the congregation. Elder Croft's wife gripped his arm, her eyes wide with a mix of acknowledgement and dread. "The night they died," Lyra added, her voice soft yet distinct, "it was not a cabin fire that took them. They came to the chapel for safety because someone was pursuing them. They hid behind the pulpit, but they were discovered anyway. The chapel became so still that the sound of breathing was unnaturally loud." Pastor Croft found himself recalling snippets of conversations from over the years. Hushed words that ceased when he entered a room, significant looks exchanged between older members when certain subjects were raised, the way a few families always placed wildflowers on an unmarked patch of ground in the cemetery. Silas Blackwood, still reeling from the earlier exposure of his financial misdeeds, jumped to his feet. "This is insanity," he proclaimed, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are spouting nonsense, inventing stories to scare us. They couldn't possibly know these things." But even as he spoke, other details began to surface from the congregation. Mrs. Jennings, Clara's mother-in-law, whispered about bloodstains that had appeared on the chapel floor years ago, stains that could not be removed, no matter how hard they were scrubbed. Old Franklin Pierce spoke of the odd sounds that sometimes emanated from the chapel late at night, sounds like children weeping that had been explained away as the wind whistling through loose floorboards. Dr. Monroe, despite his earlier humiliation regarding his medical expertise, felt compelled to speak with clinical precision. "I have always been curious about the chapel's foundation," he said slowly. "When I was helping to mend the western wall 5 years ago, we uncovered what appeared to be, well, what could have been bone fragments mixed into the original mortar." The weight of his statement settled heavily in the air. If the Ashworth family had indeed perished in the chapel, if their bodies had been secretly buried within its very structure, then every service, every prayer, every act of worship had been conducted over their unmarked graves. Alistair Finch had remained silent throughout these revelations, his weathered face etched with deep concern but no surprise. He had seen similar scenes unfold in other communities, had watched as his daughter's impossible knowledge unraveled carefully constructed falsehoods and brought long-hidden truths to light. "Mr. Finch," Pastor Croft said, his voice tense, "how do your daughters know these things? What kind of gift gives them such insight?" Alistair paused for a long moment, scanning the faces of the congregation before he replied. "I have asked myself that same question every day for years," he said at last. Their mother, Eleanor, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to perceive things beyond the normal senses. But what the girls experience is far beyond anything Eleanor ever described. They dream of places they have never been, speak of people they have never met, know details of events that happened before they were born. He looked at his daughters with a mixture of love and deep sorrow. "At first, I saw it as a blessing, a divine gift to aid my ministry to troubled souls. But over time, I have started to wonder if it is something else entirely. The knowledge they carry, it comes at a price. They bear the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's suffering. They know things children should never have to know." As if cued by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the chapel. For the first time since their arrival, they looked exactly like the children they were. Small, vulnerable, and dwarfed by the adult world in turmoil around them. "We don't choose what we see," Elara said, her previous confidence replaced by a weariness that seemed far too old for her young face. "The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes, what will be." Lyra nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Ashworth sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what truly happened to them. They want someone to remember them as they were." The chapel fell silent once more, but this time it was a silence of people wrestling with ideas that shook their fundamental beliefs about reality. Some faces showed doubt, others fear, and still others a flicker of hope that perhaps death was not the absolute end they had always assumed it to be. Pastor Croft stood at a crossroads that would shape the rest of his life. He could reject the twins' claims as fanciful tales or a calculated hoax, thereby preserving the community's fragile stability. Or he could seek the truth, regardless of the consequences, and risk shattering the very foundations on which Oakhaven was built. The choice he made would have repercussions none of them could have foreseen. That evening, as long shadows crept across Oakhaven's dirt paths, Pastor Croft found it impossible to focus on his nightly prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him profoundly, not just because of their precision, but because they had compelled him to face questions he had long avoided. He had come to Oakhaven 6 years earlier, keen to serve God in the wilderness and escape the theological debates that troubled the more established parishes in North Carolina's larger cities. His predecessor, Pastor Thaddeus Cole, had left behind meticulous records of births, deaths, and major events, but Croft had always been struck by gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest days. The winter of 1821, in particular, seemed unusually lacking in detail. There were notes about a severe winter, dwindling supplies, and the passing of several elderly residents, but the Ashworth family's tragedy was mentioned only in passing. Josiah Ashworth, his wife Abigail, and their twin daughters Mercy and Grace were lost in a cabin fire on the night of January 15th. Their earthly remains were laid to rest with proper Christian rites. What had always seemed peculiar to Croft was the absence of detail for such a momentous event. Pastor Cole was known for his thoroughness in recording even minor occurrences. Yet the death of an entire family, especially one as central as the Ashworths, was noted with uncharacteristic brevity. Driven to understand what the Finch twins might have revealed, Croft began to sift through the chapel's archived records with a new perspective. Tucked away beneath years of accumulated papers, he found a small leather-bound journal he had never seen before. The pages were water-damaged and brittle, but the script was unmistakably Pastor Cole's. What Croft read by candlelight that night would forever alter his understanding of Oakhaven's history. The journal disclosed that Pastor Cole had been deeply distressed by the circumstances of the Ashworth family's death. According to his private entries, Josiah Ashworth had learned something deeply unsettling about certain members of the community, something grave enough that he had insisted on a public confession and restitution. The exact nature of his discovery was not explicitly stated, but Cole's writings hinted at financial misconduct and possibly something far worse. On the night of January 14, 1821, Josiah Ashworth had reportedly confronted several community leaders in a tense meeting that stretched late into the night. Cole wrote of raised voices, accusations of theft and deceit, and threats of exposure that would ruin the reputations of some of Oakhaven's most esteemed families. The final entry, dated January 16, was particularly harrowing. "May the Lord forgive us for what has been done." Josiah and his family sought sanctuary in the chapel, but they were pursued. "I heard the children's cries, then silence. By morning, we found them as they had been left. Elder Croft and the others insisted we must safeguard the community's future, that the truth would be our ruin. I have consented to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul." Croft put down the journal, his hands shaking. The implications were horrifying. The Ashworth family had not died in a cabin fire. They had been murdered inside the chapel, and the community's leaders had conspired to conceal the crime. But how could the Finch twins possibly know details that had been buried for 21 years? How could they describe the children's attire, their personal keepsakes, their physical features with such accuracy? His thoughts were cut short by a gentle knock on his door. He opened it to find Elara standing in the moonlight, still in her simple dress, but with her hair neatly plaited as if she had been awake and preparing for something. "Pastor Croft," she said in her clear, childlike voice. "You found Pastor Cole's journal, didn't you? The one he concealed behind the loose brick in the hearth." Croft stared at her, stunned. He had indeed found the journal in that very spot, led by a faint draft that had drawn his attention to the loose brick. "How did you know where I should look?" he asked. "Mercy showed me in a dream," Elara answered matter-of-factly. She said Pastor Cole was a good man who was coerced into doing terrible things. She wanted someone to know the truth. The casual manner in which she spoke of receiving guidance from a long-dead child sent a shiver down Croft's spine. "Elara," he said cautiously, "what do you see when you have these dreams?" The child's face grew somber, and for a moment, Croft saw the weight of the burden she carried. "We see everything," she said plainly. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Ashworth family did not intend to harm anyone. They just wanted Josiah to remain silent about his discovery." What had he discovered? Elara looked past him into the cabin, where he could see Lyra sitting by the window, gazing out at the chapel cemetery. "The funds for the chapel building did not come from tithes," she said. "Some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the mountains. Josiah learned of it when he was asked to shoe horses that belonged to dead men." The pieces began to fit together in Croft's mind. The early years of Oakhaven had been plagued by reports of travelers vanishing on the mountain trails. Officially, these disappearances were blamed on natural perils. Bears, falls, exposure to the elements. But if Josiah Ashworth had found evidence that some travelers had been deliberately murdered and robbed. The chapel was built with blood money, Elara continued, her young voice imbued with a wisdom far beyond her years. That is why mercy and grace cannot rest. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already desecrated. Croft was confronted with a truth more horrific than anything he could have conceived. The chapel he had dedicated himself to, the sanctuary where he had sought guidance and solace, had been erected with the proceeds of murder and had itself become the scene of even greater brutality. But even as he struggled with these revelations, part of his mind remained analytical, searching. How could he prove any of this? How could he tell the difference between supernatural insight and a sophisticated deception? The answer would arrive sooner than he anticipated, and from a source that would defy every rational explanation he could have devised. The following morning brought an unforeseen visitor to Oakhaven. As the Finch family was getting ready to leave, their planned 4-day stay already prolonged by Sunday's shocking events, a lone rider approached the settlement from the eastern path. The man was in his 50s, well attired in the style of city dwellers, with a demeanor that suggested education and authority. He introduced himself to Pastor Croft as Arthur Kendrick, a lawyer from Asheville, who was seeking information about events in Oakhaven dating back to its founding. "I am here on behalf of the estate of one Julian Vance," Kendrick explained, accepting Croft's offer of hospitality. "Mr. Vance passed away recently in Charleston, and among his papers, we discovered documents indicating he had financial dealings with this community in its early days. I am trying to trace the whereabouts of certain funds that may have been irregularly handled." Croft's blood ran cold. Julian Vance was a name that had appeared in Pastor Cole's secret journal, one of several travelers who had vanished along the mountain trails between 1821 and 1822. According to Cole's notes, Vance had been carrying a substantial amount of money for land acquisitions in Virginia. Before Croft could frame a reply, Elara materialized at his side with the uncanny timing that marked so many of her appearances. She looked up at Kendrick with inquisitive eyes and said, "Mr. Vance had a silver pocket watch with his initials engraved on the inside of the case. It had a scratch across the glass because he dropped it when he was thrown from his horse." Kendrick's composure fractured. "How could you possibly know about Julian Vance's watch?" he demanded. "That detail was mentioned only in his private letters to his wife." Lyra appeared beside her sister as if by an unseen summons. "The watch is buried behind the chapel," she said quietly, along with his coin purse and his horse's saddlebags. "Elder Croft put them there after what happened on the trail." The implications hit Croft with the force of a physical blow. If the twins were right, if Julian Vance's personal belongings were indeed buried behind the chapel, it would be definitive proof that their knowledge was far beyond that of any normal child. More importantly, it would provide concrete evidence of the crimes that had financed Oakhaven's establishment. Kendrick dismounted with a sense of urgency. "I insist we begin digging in that area immediately," he declared. "If what these children say is true, we are dealing with evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Croft, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, came forward with clear reluctance. At 75, he was the only surviving member of the original leadership that had made those early decisions. His weathered face was a mask of resignation and defiance. "You speak of matters you do not understand, stranger," Croft said, his voice carrying the authority of his age and position. "This community was built by God-fearing folk who did what was necessary to survive in this wilderness." "Survival is no justification for murder," Kendrick retorted sharply. If these claims are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal enterprise. Elara looked up at Elder Croft with those unsettling green eyes that seemed to see too much. "Mr. Croft," she said softly, "the nightmares ceased after the second year, didn't they? You told yourself that was a sign of God's forgiveness." The elder's composure crumbled. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about. No one knows. About the dreams where Julian Vance pleaded with you to spare his life," Lyra continued, her gentle voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "About how you see his face each night before you sleep." The old man sank onto a nearby log as if his legs could no longer hold him. "It wasn't meant to happen that way," he said, his voice cracking. "We only wanted the money. We were desperate. Our children were ill, and the winter was harsh. But Vance fought back, and then," his confession lingered in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Pastor Croft realized he was witnessing the complete unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his chapel, and his faith. Alistair Finch, who had stood silently through these revelations, finally spoke. "The truth has a way of coming to the surface," he said softly. "My daughters do not choose what they reveal. They are simply vessels for information that must be heard." Kendrick wasted no time organizing a digging party. Within hours, several men from the community were excavating the ground behind the chapel, guided by the twins' precise instructions. Pastor Croft watched with a growing sense of dread, aware that each spadeful of dirt brought them closer to evidence that would shatter Oakhaven's carefully crafted identity. They did not have to dig far. 4 feet below the surface, their shovels hit something hard. Gently clearing away the soil, they unearthed a tarnished silver pocket watch. Its glass was indeed scratched, just as Elara had described. The initials JV were clearly visible on the inside of the case. Next to the watch was a leather coin purse, its contents long decayed, but its presence undeniable. The horses' saddlebags, though rotted from years in the ground, were still identifiable. Kendrick inspected each item with the methodical precision of a man used to building legal arguments. "This watch is an exact match to the description in Julian Vance's letters," he announced. "The scratch on the glass, the engraving, even the unusual clasp on the chain. Every detail is precisely as his wife described it. But it was Elder Croft's reaction that served as the most damning confirmation." The old man stared at the recovered objects with the look of someone seeing apparitions, his lips moving in what could have been a prayer or a confession. "There were others," he said at last, his voice barely a whisper. "Vance was not the first, and he was not the last. The trail through these mountains was ideal for what we had to do. Travelers passed through regularly, mostly alone, often with money for land purchases or business. The full scope of the crimes was becoming clear. Oakhaven had not been built on hard work and divine blessing. It had been financed by a systematic campaign of robbery and murder that had gone on for years. But even as the evidence mounted, Croft found himself wrestling with questions that went beyond the immediate crimes. How could the Finch twins know details that no living person should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met, crimes that occurred before their birth, and the location of evidence hidden for decades? The answers would prove to be more disturbing than any rational explanation he could have imagined, and they would force him to confront the possibility that death was not the end he had always believed it to be. As the sun set over Oakhaven that evening, casting long shadows over the excavation site and the chapel cemetery, Croft realized his community was at a precipice. The truth was finally coming to light after 21 years of careful concealment. But with it came questions that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about justice, redemption, and the very nature of reality. The Finch twins stood together in the fading light, their small forms silhouetted against the chapel built with blood money and consecrated with innocent blood. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear, their faces turned toward the cemetery where so many secrets lay buried under unmarked earth. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, but tonight belonged to the dead, who had finally found their voices through two 10-year-old children who possessed knowledge that defied all rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and cold over Oakhaven, bringing with it a delegation of officials from the county seat. Word of the previous day's discoveries had traveled fast, and lawyer Kendrick had wasted no time in contacting the authorities. By mid-morning, the small settlement found itself host to a county sheriff, a territorial judge, and two federal marshals who had been investigating the disappearances of travelers along the mountain trails for years. Judge Sterling, a stern man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, had established his temporary court in the chapel itself, a choice that struck Pastor Croft as grimly appropriate given the building's blood-soaked history. The entire community had been summoned to attend what would amount to both a hearing and a reckoning. Elder Croft, his health visibly deteriorating under the weight of his confessions, sat in the front pew, flanked by two other elderly men who had been part of the original leadership council. Their faces bore the hollow look of men who had carried terrible secrets for too long. But it was the Finch twins who commanded the most attention. Judge Sterling had initially been skeptical of claims that two children possessed supernatural knowledge, but the previous day's discoveries had forced him to reconsider. He had spent the morning interviewing them separately, trying to determine how they could possibly know details about crimes that predated their births. Elara Finch, Judge Sterling said, his voice echoing in the wooden chapel. Please tell this court exactly how you knew the location of Julian Vance's personal effects. Elara stood in the witness area, looking impossibly small beneath the weight of adult attention. Mercy Ashworth told me in a dream, she said simply. She said the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed the travelers. She wanted everyone to know the truth. And you, Lyra Finch? The judge continued. How do you know details about events that occurred years before your birth? Lyra's voice was barely audible as she responded. The dreams come to both of us. We see what happened as if we were there. We see the fear in people's eyes. We hear their last words. We feel their pain. Judge Sterling leaned forward in his chair. Are you claiming to communicate with the spirits of the dead? Alistair Finch rose from his seat. Your Honor, if I may, my daughters have never claimed to understand their abilities. They simply report what they experience. I've witnessed them provide accurate information about dozens of communities we've visited, information they couldn't possibly have obtained through normal means. Sheriff Brody, a practical man more concerned with evidence than supernatural claims, addressed the twins directly. Can you tell us how many people were killed along these mountain trails? Elara and Lyra exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Elara answered. 9 men over 4 years. Most were traveling alone with money for land purchases or business ventures. One was a minister like Papa, but he carried silver dollars hidden in his boot heel. The specificity of their answer sent murmurs through the assembled crowd. Lyra continued where her sister left off, their tag team delivery as unsettling as always. The minister's name was Gideon Stone. He was going to establish a new parish in Virginia. His horse was a chestnut stallion with a white blaze on its forehead. Sheriff Brody consulted a worn notebook he had pulled from his coat. His face grew pale as he found the entry he was looking for. Gideon Stone disappeared along this route in October of 1822, he confirmed. The description of his horse matches our records exactly. But it was what happened next that would shake everyone present to their very core. Elder Croft, his hands trembling with age and guilt, struggled to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "I can bear this burden no longer. What these children say is true. Every word of it. But there's something else. Something worse than the murders we committed." The chapel fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "The Ashworth family," Croft continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "They didn't just stumble upon evidence of our crimes. Josiah Ashworth was my brother-in-law. I confided in him about what we were doing, thinking family loyalty would keep him quiet. But Josiah had a conscience stronger than his loyalty." Pastor Croft felt the world tilting around him as Elder Croft's confession unfolded. "Josiah threatened to expose us all unless we made restitution to the families of the dead. He said he would ride to Asheville himself and report our crimes to the territorial authorities. We couldn't let that happen. Too many families depended on what we had built here." The elder's voice dropped to a whisper. "On the night of January 15, 1821, we followed the Ashworth family to the chapel. Josiah had brought Abigail and the twins here, thinking sacred ground would protect them. But we were desperate men with everything to lose." Elara had grown very still during the confession, her young face pale but determined. "Tell them about the babies," she said quietly. The elder's composure cracked completely. "Dear God," he sobbed. "How could you know about the babies?" Judge Sterling leaned forward intently. "What babies? Explain yourself, man." "Abigail Ashworth was with child when we killed her," Croft said, the words seeming to tear from his throat. 7 months along with twins. The doctor said they might have lived if we had gotten help instead of." He couldn't finish the sentence. Lyra stepped forward, her soft voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "That's why we can see everything so clearly. Mercy and Grace Ashworth weren't the only children who died that night. Their unborn sisters died with them. 4 souls crying out for justice." The theological implications of Lyra's statement sent shock waves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were somehow channeling the spirits of the dead Ashworth children, including the unborn, it suggested an understanding of the afterlife that challenged fundamental Methodist doctrine. Dr. Monroe, the community's unofficial physician, found his voice. "I assisted with the burial," he said slowly. We found evidence of the pregnancy, but we told ourselves the babies had been too young to have souls, that they wouldn't need proper burial rites." "Every soul matters to God," Alistair Finch said firmly. "Every life, no matter how brief, has eternal significance." But Judge Sterling was more concerned with earthly justice than theological debate. "Mr. Croft, are you confessing to the murder of Josiah Ashworth, his wife Abigail, their twin daughters, and 2 unborn children?" "I am," the elder replied, his voice hollow with despair. "And to the murders of 9 travelers who trusted us with their lives. We are all guilty, myself, Elias Vance, and Jeremiah Crow. We planned it together. We carried it out together, and we've hidden it together for 21 years." The 2 other elderly men named in the confession sat in stunned silence, their faces masks of resignation and terror. The weight of 21 years of collective guilt had finally become too heavy to bear. Sheriff Brody stood and began placing the 3 men under arrest, but Judge Sterling raised a hand to stop him. Before we proceed with formal charges, the judge said, I need to understand how these children could possibly know details that were never recorded, never spoken of, never shared outside the circle of perpetrators. Elara looked up at the judge with those unnaturally knowing green eyes. Your Honor, she said in her clear, childish voice, some truths are too big to stay buried forever. The Ashworth sisters and their unborn babies have been waiting 21 years for someone to hear their story. But how do you hear them? Judge Sterling pressed. What mechanism allows this communication? Lyra joined her sister at the front of the chapel. We don't understand it any more than you do, she said honestly. Ever since we were very small, we've had dreams about places we've never been and people we've never met. Papa says our mama had the gift of second sight, but what we experience is different. Different how? Elara and Lyra exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Elara answered. Mama could sense things about living people, their emotions, their intentions, their hidden thoughts. But we see beyond that. We see the echoes that tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled. Alistair Finch had been listening to his daughters with growing concern. Your Honor, he said, I've spent years trying to understand my daughter's abilities. I've consulted with ministers, doctors, and scholars throughout North Carolina and Virginia. None can explain it, but all have witnessed its accuracy. Judge Sterling was quiet for a long moment, studying the twins with a mixture of fascination and unease. Miss Elara, Miss Lyra, he said finally, if you truly possess this gift, then perhaps you can tell us where the bodies of the other victims were disposed of. The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implication. If the twins could locate the remains of Julian Vance and the other murdered travelers, it would provide the final proof needed to close cases that had baffled authorities for years. Elara closed her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. Some are in the old silver mine west of town, she said after a moment. Others were thrown into Serpent's Ravine, where the current runs strongest. But 3 were buried beneath the chapel floor, their bones mixed with the foundation stones. The revelation that 3 murder victims had been interred beneath the chapel itself sent a collective shudder through the congregation. Pastor Croft realized with horror that he had been conducting services, celebrating communion, and offering prayers for salvation while standing directly over the unmarked graves of innocent men. Sheriff Brody looked to Judge Sterling for direction. Your Honor, if we're to verify these claims, we'll need to excavate the chapel floor itself. And we will, Judge Sterling replied grimly. But first, I want to understand the full scope of these crimes. He turned back to Elder Croft. Where is the money stolen from these victims? What was done with their possessions? The elder gestured weakly toward the chapel building around them. Everything went into building our community. The chapel, the school, the grist mill. All of it was built with blood money. We told ourselves we were creating something good from something evil, that God would forgive us if we used the money for righteous purposes. And the victims' families? Judge Sterling asked. Did any of you consider the wives, children, parents who never learned what happened to their loved ones? It was Lyra who answered, her young voice carrying a weight of sadness that seemed inappropriate for her age. Julian Vance had a wife named Annabelle and 2 young daughters. Gideon Stone was engaged to be married to a woman named Sarah, who waited for him until she died of influenza 4 years later. Most of the others had families who spent years wondering, hoping, grieving without closure. The specificity of her knowledge about the victims' personal lives was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire ordeal. These weren't just names and dates. The twins spoke of the murdered men as if they had known them personally, as if they carried the weight of their unfulfilled dreams and abandoned responsibilities. Judge Sterling stood and addressed the assembled crowd. "This court will recess while we conduct a thorough investigation of the claims made here today. Sheriff Brody will coordinate the excavation of the chapel floor and the search of the locations identified by the Finch children. Elder Croft, Elias Vance, and Jeremiah Crow will remain in custody pending formal charges." As the three elderly men were led away in shackles, the congregation began to disperse in stunned silence. 21 years of carefully maintained lies had crumbled in a single morning, leaving a community to grapple with the knowledge that their entire foundation was built on murder and deceit. But for Pastor Croft, the most disturbing questions remained unanswered. How could two 10-year-old children possess knowledge that defied every natural law? What did their abilities suggest about the nature of death, the persistence of consciousness, and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead? The Finch twins stood together in the emptying chapel, their small figures dwarfed by the magnitude of what they had revealed. They seemed tired, drained by the emotional weight of channeling so much pain and injustice. "Papa," Elara said quietly, "can we leave now? The voices are getting louder, and it's hard to keep them all straight." Alistair Finch gathered his daughters close, his weathered face showing deep concern for the burden they carried. "Soon," he promised, "but first, we need to help these people understand what you've shown them." As the sun reached its zenith over Oakhaven, casting sharp shadows across the chapel cemetery and the excavation site behind the building, the community prepared for revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, redemption, and the eternal consequences of earthly actions. The truth was finally emerging from 21 years of darkness, but with it came questions that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The excavation of Oakhaven's chapel floor took 3 days. Working methodically under Judge Sterling's supervision, Sheriff Brody's team removed the wooden planks and began carefully digging through the packed earth beneath. What they found confirmed the Finch twins' claims with chilling accuracy. 3 complete skeletons lay buried beneath the sanctuary, their bones indeed mixed with the foundation stones as Elara had described. Personal effects found with the remains matched descriptions from missing person reports dating back to 1821 and 1822. A silver ring bearing the initials IH belonged to Isaac Hemlock, a land surveyor who had disappeared while mapping territorial boundaries. A bone-handled knife was identified as belonging to Franklin Pierce, a merchant whose family had searched for him across 3 states. But it was the third set of remains that provided the most disturbing confirmation of the twins' impossible knowledge. Around the skeleton's neck was a distinctive pewter cross that had been described in great detail by the family of Gideon Stone, a traveling minister who had vanished while carrying donation money for a new parish in Virginia. As each piece of evidence was carefully catalogued, the scope of Oakhaven's crimes became undeniably clear. This had not been a single act of desperate violence, but a calculated campaign of murder and robbery that had lasted for years. Judge Sterling, his silver hair seeming to have gained more gray during the investigation, addressed the reassembled community on the 4th day. "The evidence before this court is overwhelming," he announced. 9 men were murdered along these mountain trails between 1821 and 1825. Their killers used the stolen money to build this settlement, then compounded their crimes by murdering the Ashworth family to protect their secret. Elder Croft, Elias Vance, and Jeremiah Crow stood before the judge in shackles, their faces showing the hollow exhaustion of men who had carried unbearable guilt for too long. At their advanced ages, they knew they would never live to see freedom again. The most disturbing aspect of these crimes, Judge Sterling continued, is not their brutality, but their calculated nature. These men didn't kill in passion or desperation. They created a systematic method for identifying and murdering travelers, then used their victims' money to build what they presented as a godly community. Pastor Croft listened to the judge's words with a growing sense of spiritual crisis. Everything he had devoted himself to serving, the chapel, the community, the shared faith that bound them together, had been built on a foundation of innocent blood. How could he continue to minister in a place so thoroughly corrupted by evil? But it was the Finch twins who provided the most profound insight into the spiritual implications of Oakhaven's crimes. Judge Sterling, Elara said, her clear voice carrying easily through the packed chapel. "May we speak about forgiveness?" The judge looked down at the 10-year-old girl with a mixture of amazement and respect. After 3 days of witnessing her impossible knowledge proved accurate in every detail, he had learned to listen carefully to anything she said. "Of course, child, what would you like to say?" Elara and Lyra moved to stand together at the front of the chapel, beneath the wooden cross that had presided over 21 years of collective deception. "The Ashworth sisters want everyone to know that they forgive the men who killed them," Elara said. "They understand that fear makes people do terrible things." Lyra continued the thought, as she so often did. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The men who committed these crimes must face earthly justice, and the community must find a way to make things right with the families of the victims." Judge Sterling nodded solemnly. "The court agrees with that assessment. Elder Croft, Elias Vance, and Jeremiah Crow will face trial for multiple counts of murder and robbery. But what of the community itself? What of the chapel and buildings constructed with stolen money?" It was Alistair Finch who answered, his weathered face reflecting deep thought. "Your Honor, in Scripture we find that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children, if the children choose righteousness over convenience. This community can be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and genuine repentance." Pastor Croft found his voice for the first time since the investigation began. "The chapel building itself must be consecrated anew," he said firmly. "We'll remove and properly bury the remains found beneath the floor. We'll identify and compensate the victims' families to the extent possible, and we'll establish a memorial to ensure these crimes are never forgotten." Lawyer Kendrick, who had been documenting everything for his legal records, looked up from his notes. "The Julian Vance estate alone is entitled to significant restitution. His widow has authorized me to pursue full recovery of the stolen funds plus damages for 21 years of family anguish." Elder Croft, despite his shackles and failing health, managed to speak. "The money is gone," he said quietly. "Spent over the years on community improvements, individual family needs, chapel maintenance. We have nothing left to give. Then the community itself bears responsibility," Judge Sterling declared. "The buildings constructed with stolen money will be sold. The proceeds distributed to victims' families as partial restitution. Oakhaven will effectively cease to exist as a settlement." The implications of the judge's decision struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Families who had spent 21 years building lives in Oakhaven would lose their homes, their chapel, their entire community structure. Children would be uprooted, elderly residents displaced, a generation of stability destroyed by the crimes of their leaders. But it was Elara Finch who provided the most chilling final revelation. "Judge Sterling," she said, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible at her age. "There's something else you need to know about Oakhaven. The crimes didn't stop in 1825. The chapel fell silent except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant thunder of an approaching storm. "What do you mean, child?" Judge Sterling asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lyra stepped forward to stand beside her sister. "The silver mine where some of the bodies were thrown. It's not just a place where old crimes were hidden. People are still disappearing along these mountain trails." Sheriff Brody straightened in his chair. "Are you saying these murders have continued?" "Not the same people," Elara clarified. "Most of the original killers are too old now. But others learned from their example. The techniques, the locations, the methods of disposing of evidence. Knowledge like that doesn't die with its creators." The implications of her statement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were correct, Oakhaven's crimes had spawned a tradition of violence that had persisted for decades, claiming additional victims whose disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers. Judge Sterling rose from his chair, his face grim with determination. "Sheriff Brody, we'll need to expand our investigation immediately. If there are more recent crimes connected to this location, we must uncover them all." As the legal proceedings continued around them, the Finch twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted after 4 days of revelation and testimony. They had served as voices for the dead, conduits for justice denied, instruments of truth that could no longer be suppressed. Alistair Finch gathered his daughters close, his weathered face showing deep relief mixed with concern for what lay ahead. "Are you ready to leave this place?" he asked gently. Elara looked around the chapel one final time, her green eyes taking in the wooden walls, the simple cross, the faces of people whose lives had been forever changed by her testimony. "The voices are quieter now," she said softly. "Mercy and grace can rest." Lyra nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "But there will be other places, other voices. Papa, why do we have to carry all this sadness?" Alistair knelt down to his daughter's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know, little ones. But I believe God gives special burdens only to those strong enough to bear them. Perhaps your gift, whatever it is, serves a purpose larger than any of us can understand." As the Finch family prepared to leave Oakhaven, taking their mysterious abilities and terrible knowledge with them, Pastor Croft found himself facing the most difficult decision of his ministry. Should he stay and help rebuild what could be salvaged from the community's ruins, or should he flee from a place so thoroughly tainted by violence and deception? The answer came as he watched the twins walking hand in hand toward their father's side. If 2 10-year-old children could bear the weight of such devastating truth with grace and forgiveness, perhaps there was hope for redemption, even in the darkest places. 3 weeks later, Oakhaven was a ghost town. The chapel building had been dismantled board by board, its materials sold to help compensate victims' families. The community's residents had scattered to other settlements across North Carolina and Virginia, carrying with them the knowledge that their entire foundation had been built on innocent blood. But in parishes across the region, a new story began to spread, the story of 2 young girls who possessed knowledge that defied rational explanation, who served as voices for the dead and instruments of long-delayed justice. Some dismissed the tale as frontier superstition. Others embraced it as evidence of divine intervention in human affairs. The Finch family continued their circuit through the remote parishes of Appalachia, and reports continued to follow them. Communities experiencing spiritual renewal, long-buried secrets coming to light, mysteries solved through impossible knowledge possessed by twin girls who spoke with the authority of prophets despite their tender age. Judge Sterling's final report on the Oakhaven investigation filled 52 pages and documented crimes spanning more than 2 decades. His concluding paragraph would be quoted in legal texts for generations. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. While science cannot explain the source of the Finch children's knowledge, the accuracy of their testimony cannot be disputed. Perhaps some truths are indeed too important to remain buried forever. Pastor Croft eventually established a new ministry in Eastern Virginia where he spent the remainder of his career helping communities confront difficult truths and seek genuine redemption. He never forgot the 4 days in Oakhaven when 2 10-year-old girls had torn apart 21 years of carefully constructed lies with knowledge that no living person should have possessed. The mystery of Elara and Lyra Finch's abilities was never solved. Medical experts of the era had no framework for understanding their impossible knowledge, and religious authorities were divided on whether their gifts represented divine blessing or something far more complex. What remains undisputed is the historical record of their accuracy. Every detail they revealed about Oakhaven's crimes proved correct. Every location they identified yielded the evidence they claimed would be found. Every secret they exposed was verified through independent investigation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their story is not what they revealed about the past, but what they suggested about the nature of justice itself. If the dead truly cannot rest while their murderers remain hidden, if innocence possesses some power to transcend death and demand accountability, then perhaps our understanding of moral consequence extends far beyond the boundaries of earthly life. The Finch twins vanished from historical records sometime in the 1850s, their fate as mysterious as their abilities. Some say they continued their father's ministry until their own deaths, serving as instruments of truth in communities across the American frontier. Others believe they eventually learned to suppress their terrible gift and lived quiet, normal lives far from the circuit parishes where their reputation had been established. But in the remote corners of Appalachia, in settlements where old secrets still fester and ancient crimes remain unpunished, travelers sometimes report encountering twin sisters who possess knowledge no living person should have. They speak of the dead with casual familiarity, reveal truths that have been buried for generations, and remind the guilty that some forms of justice transcend the limitations of mortal law. Whether these encounters represent the same Finch twins, their spiritual legacy, or something else entirely remains a mystery that science cannot solve and faith cannot fully explain. What we know with certainty is that truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. And sometimes, just sometimes, it finds voices willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The files on the Oakhaven investigation remain in the North Carolina State Archives, available to researchers who wish to verify the extraordinary claims made in this account. Judge Sterling's meticulous documentation, Sheriff Brody's evidence reports, and Pastor Croft's personal journals all corroborate the essential facts of this case. But the deeper mystery, the question of how 2 10-year-old children could possess impossible knowledge and serve as voices for the dead, remains as unsolved today as it was in 1842. Some truths, it seems, are destined to remain beyond the reach of human understanding, dwelling in that shadowland between faith and reason, where the most profound mysteries of existence continue to elude our grasp. Do you believe the Finch twins truly communicated with the spirits of murder victims? Do you think their knowledge could be explained through natural means we simply don't understand? The evidence supports their accuracy, but the source of their abilities remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries. What's your theory about the Finch twins? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Are you brave enough to consider the possibility that death is not the end of consciousness? Or do you believe there's a rational explanation for their impossible knowledge? Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality, and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Until next time, remember that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. And sometimes the most innocent voices carry the most devastating truths.